So this is a video that you guys have probably been waiting for a long time. I've spent a good bit of time working on researching different topics that are in this Nvidia control panel, and today we're going to be going through each one of these settings that's within it, and I'll give you guys my opinions on it, and then we'll see what works best for you to get you the most performance out of your Nvidia settings. One thing that I want you guys to keep in mind is that a lot of the information on this stuff is pretty old, just because this software itself is also equally as old. So take it with a grain of salt. Some of these settings only affect like DirectX titles or OpenGL applications, things like that. So keep in mind it may not apply to every single game, and it may not even apply to Tarkov. But the point of a lot of this is for you guys to understand what these settings are, and then for you guys to test them yourselves on your system to possibly get some more frames. Regardless of that stuff, I'm just going to hop straight into it, and there will be timestamps in the timeline for the video, so you guys can jump around to any setting you want to get some quick background on. Keep in mind there are some settings that aren't put in my Nvidia control panel, so if you have any questions about settings that are not listed here, feel free to post them in the comments below or on my Discord, which will also be linked in the description, and we can help you get that question answered. Starting off with image scaling, this is the Nvidia image scaling, or NIS, that you might have heard some people talk about. I have a video on my channel discussing this sort of thing. So if you want to learn more about Nvidia image scaling, you can check on my video I made about, I don't know, it was like a year and a half ago, something like that. It is older, and it's back before FSR 2.1 or 2.2, I think it is now in the game, or was in the game. And you should use that over NIS any day of the week. But if you still want to learn about it, I do have a video that's up about it, so I'll link that down below as well. Now to the first juicy setting here, it's Ambient Occlusion. So essentially, according to Unity docs, Ambient Occlusion is a post-processing effect that approximates crevice shadows in real time, darkening creases, holes, intersections, and surfaces that are close to each other. Probably seen this before in games like Modern Warfare 2, I know that's in that game, other like AAA titles. It's any of the soft shadows that you see in like corners or little like crevices between objects, stuff like that. That's what this setting is. Now, since this is a competitive game, like Tarkov is a competitive game, or if you do play any other sort of competitive game, it really doesn't give you an advantage to have this on. It can sometimes give you a disadvantage depending on if they're being a rat and hiding in those corners. So I would leave this disabled. But just keep in mind, it doesn't directly disable these effects in-game most of the time. It only disables the forced Nvidia ambient occlusions that may be present in games. So you can disable it through that, but you need to make sure it's also disabled in-game for this to fully take effect. Anisotropic filtering now. I keep this set to application controlled, but for best optimization, you probably should have it off technically. You can control this yourself, but essentially what this is it's a texture filtering technique that aims to make distant and like oblique angled textures look sharper than they actually are. I'll have a comparison in Escape from Tarkov so you can see directly what I'm talking about, and you can probably tell that on the on setting in Tarkov, the road that I'm currently looking at in this screenshot looks a lot better, is a lot more clear. So if you want clearer textures, I would definitely recommend setting this to per texture in Tarkov, but as a whole I would leave this at application control, just so that you're not making games look more blurry than you might think they should be. And if you are experiencing games being more blurry than they should be, this might be the root cause of that. I'd recommend turning up anisotropic filtering if you feel like those sort of oblique textures are harder to see. There's also some notes that I've seen in different articles about its VRAM consumption. But I did test this at least in Tarkov, and there was maybe at max an 100 megabyte difference on my card, which is a 3070 Ti. Your mileage may vary, but if you're really struggling with VRAM, maybe you want to try to turn this down a little bit. You can always try to force it to be a lower multiplication so that you're not sampling as many times and you're reducing the VRAM consumption if you are really struggling to stay under your VRAM limit. Next here we got FXAA, which stands for Fast Approximate Anti-Aliasing. So unlike the TAA setting that you see in games like Tarkov, FXAA is an algorithm that passes over the screen once per frame using only that data. So it's not like temporal anti-aliasing where it takes multiple frames data into account, or like motion vectors or anything like that. And it uses that data to attempt to produce a higher quality image with low performance impact. And when I say higher quality image, I just mean getting rid of any of those jagged edges, or for some reason Nvidia calls them jaggies. I don't know if that's going to get me demonetized, but it is an algorithm, so it has to detect that those edges are there to attempt to get rid of them. It is post-processing, so it only happens after your frame is rendered, like I said. And it can tend to look more blurry than other options just because it has no sort of color correction. I also noticed this when I was testing in Tarkov as well, as it did look a bit more blurry with FXAA. So I would opt for TAA instead, as you're getting more data into the anti-aliasing, and you're going to get a better image besides trees. Trees are kind of a one-off thing. If you look at trees, and for some reason they're super blurry, and I don't know why. But regardless, I would still recommend TAA, as the grittiness of FXAA is just a bit too much for me. But again, it's your call. Keep in mind, setting it specifically in here may not directly affect the anti-aliasing in-game. You'd have to look and see if it actually directly causes it to change. It shouldn't, as it's mainly used to force it onto older titles. But if it does, you might be able to use this if you do like FXAA. Next, we got gamma correction. Supposedly, this allows for, and I quote from, well, this website, allows for the quote-unquote correction of brightness values within an anti-aliasing enhanced image. But this really only affects MFAA and then another obscure anti-aliasing method, so it won't affect you in most games. So I personally just had this on in the games that might use MFAA, as it won't degrade your performance anywhere else. And the games that have it, and the games that you are going to have it enabled in, you can probably spare the extra FPS, as it's more of a single player experience in the first place. If you'd like to see about possibly enabling this for other anti-aliasing methods through Nvidia Profile Inspector, I did find a link that I will throw in the description of a thread on Tech Power Up talking about the method to do so if you're interested. So as far as the other two settings we have here, mode and setting for anti-aliasing, Nvidia has their own documentation for these settings, which I can discuss for you really quick. The settings that they have in here, though, seem to only apply towards older games or games that don't necessarily have anti-aliasing, so I wouldn't worry about this too much, but if you're interested, there are 4 different settings that you can choose from, and Nvidia describes them as being in 4 separate scenarios. Scenario 1 is the game does not have an anti-aliasing control, and that's when you can select the override option that's here. Option 2 is the game has its own anti-aliasing controls and includes settings that you want to use, so then you can set it to application control. The game has its own anti-aliasing controls, but has only an enable, disabled, or on-off option. That's where you can put enhance. And for example, if I choose enhance here, you can set the anti-aliasing mode to be 248x to help with anti-aliasing in a video game if you want. And then finally, the final option is game does not support anti-aliasing, and that's when you can also override. You can also straight up turn off anti-aliasing if you're some sort of lunatic who wants a bunch of jagged edges in their video games for some reason. But besides that, I would just leave this to application control to move on with your life. And finally, there's transparency. I just suggest having this off. It supposedly helps minimize the visible aliasing on objects that have like some transparency. So if you think about glass, you think about like fencing or wires in the air, stuff like that. It's supposedly supposed to help with things like that, but I can't really find much relevant information on this setting. And also when I set this on and test in different games, I've really struggled to see a difference whatsoever. So I just leave this off. Most sites suggested to turn it off for increased performance, but some stated that it helped tree branches and other objects look more crisp, like on Reddit, but again, I wasn't able to see this difference. Background application max frame rate, you guys probably know what this does, I don't really need to explain it. You can set this to your own personal preference, whatever frame rate you want it to run in when you're not tabbed in is fine, or you can just leave this off if you don't care to limit the frame rate when you're not tabbed in. CUDA GPUs, you can just keep that at default. That's just saying what GPUs can be used by quote-unquote CUDA applications. You don't need to worry about this whatsoever. And now DSR factors and smoothness. This pisses me off. I'm just kidding, but I see a lot of people suggesting these settings to try and increase their GPU usage specifically, even though it doesn't get them more frame rate. I'm going to explain what this does and everything like that in a moment. Essentially, DSR stands for Dynamic Super Resolution. It was released with the 900 series, so the Maxwell architecture of NVIDIA GPUs, and it can provide increased image fidelity for games that have the graphical headroom to do so, aka if your CPU bottlenecked in Tarkov. And it does this by rendering at a higher than native resolution and then downscaling it back down to your monitor's native resolution. I simply do not recommend this for a competitive game like Tarkov. Even though most of you are probably CPU bottlenecked, I don't think that the extra power draw and the possibility of increased frame fluctuation at a 100% GPU utilization is worth it. So I recommend heavily to have this off unless you really like how it looks with it on and you have a ton of headroom to spare. Tarkov is just one of those competitive shooters, and having this on really won't help you in the long run, especially if you're aiming for maximum frame rate at all times. Low latency mode is another one of those settings that's kind of iffy. To keep a long story short, your CPU can quote unquote prepare frames in advance before they are processed through the GPU and put on your screen, and that's called a queue. So this setting determines how many of those queued frames you can have before it, well, doesn't keep queuing frames. Off on these settings is unlimited queuing. On is a maximum of 1 queued frame, and ultra is no queuing. Ultra can cause stutters in a hard CPU bottleneck, so leaving it at just on allows for a little breathing room while still cutting down on some system latency. This is normally overcome by Nvidia Reflex anyway, and Nvidia Reflex is in Tarkov, so really you don't need to worry about this setting, but it does help in other applications where Nvidia Reflex isn't a thing yet. Or if it's like an older title, stuff of that nature, you should experience a little bit less latency if you just have this set to on. And it hopefully won't introduce any stuttering. You can try Ultra, but just keep in mind you may get some stuttering, especially if you are running into CPU bottlenecks. Max frame rate, again, personal preference, I have this set to off. Monitor technology, you're going to want this set to fixed refresh. I just use G-Sync sometimes, and I know people are going to hang me, just like they did in the Crucible for this sort of shit, but honestly, I don't care. And a fixed refresh is the best if you want the crispest, fastest gaming experience. But sometimes I just like not having jagged edges, so I keep G-Sync compatible on just for the off case where I want to use it. Essentially, G-Sync is just like Nvidia's version of V-Sync, except it, that was a huge voice crack, by the way, holy shit. It just works with Nvidia hardware, and it's interlaced in some monitors, and AMD has their own options with it, with FreeSync and all that stuff, so you don't need to worry about it. If you want the quickest response times possible, just set it to fixed refresh, and you might not have this option if your monitor doesn't support G-Sync, so don't even worry, just keep it at fixed. Now, MFAA, or multi-frame sampled anti-aliasing, I would just keep this at off. If we talked about multi-sampled anti-aliasing or MSAA before, or if you know of that type of anti-aliasing, it's simply an upgraded version of that. There's actually a really good Nvidia official video that I'll have linked either in the description, or if I share the script for this video, I'll put it in there too. But it explains a lot of this a lot better than I will. But the TLDR is that this multi-frame sampling takes different parts of a pixel to average out what color there should be on that pixel. And that really helps reduce the amount of jagged edges that you see, or jaggies, in any given game. It can be a little intensive though, so I recommend just to have this off, especially since you're not going to be using MSA and Tarkov in the first place, so you can just have this off. If you want to try it on and see if it works in your games, if you like how it looks, great, you can use it. But yeah, just want to let you guys know what that was about. These next two settings here, I really don't, you don't need to worry about this. Just keep it to auto. It may cause some compatibility issues in the long run with different things, so setting this to just prefer performance is really the best way. And OpenGL running GPU you also don't need to worry about, because you only have this GPU in the first place. If you want to set it to your main GPU, you can. This isn't really worth your time to worry about. Now for another juicy setting that I can't wait to discuss and see in the comment section, is power management mode. Personally, and this is a personal opinion that I have developed based on my time using these different settings, I prefer the normal or adaptive power setting. They've changed the name of this a couple times, I think. It was called adaptive before, so if you see adaptive or normal, that's sort of the plan that I'm recommending. And then I would recommend, if you want maximum performance and maximum reductions in latency on certain applications, then I would go, say, the program settings over here and choose the game, say Tarkov or Valorant or whatever, and set it specifically to maximum performance for those games. This will just make sure that you're not chewing up through power when you don't need to be. And I mean, if you're power conscious at all, then this might be a good setting for you to follow in my footsteps in. Otherwise, then you could just set it to prefer maximum performance globally and then just move on with your life. Nvidia themselves does state that setting power management mode from adaptive to maximum performance can improve performance in certain applications when the GPU is throttling, like clock speeds, for example, when it shouldn't be, that is. Really, it's your choice if you want to use this or not, or even if you see a difference in performance, whether it's on normal or prefer max performance. This is one of those settings that I would allow you to test and, just figure out what works best for your system. Preferred refresh rate, I don't even need to mention this. Highest available. Shader cache size is another one of those interesting settings that I wanted to talk about for a little bit. I have this personally set away from driver default to 10 gigabytes for the sole reason of me playing Star Citizen. So that's one of the optimizations I've seen floating around that community, is by setting the shader cache higher, you can reduce the amount of stutters. So I've been trying that out. But if you don't know what shader cache is, it's essentially where your compiled shaders are stored. And Nvidia says, quote, shader compiles are normally performed each time a game runs and are a common cause of gameplay stuttering. So if you want less stuttering, you can try to set this higher just to make sure that cached files are saved. But just keep in mind, it will store these like on your drive, so you need to make sure you have the storage space on your drive in order to like accommodate this. Leaving this to driver default also shouldn't cause any issues. Just keep in mind this is erased every single time you update drivers, so there may be some stutters in games after you boot them up after a fresh install. So if you all of a sudden update your drivers and notice stuttering, this could be the cause of that stuttering. So run through a couple raids or what have you, play a couple matches of the game until the shaders are fully compiled, or just let it sit there for a minute, and then you should hopefully notice less stuttering because the shaders have not compiled and you've done everything you need to do. Into the second tree that we have on Nvidia Control Panel, we have texture filtering. I'm going to go setting by setting here just to discuss each one of these without branching into the whole topic. So anisotropic sample optimization limits the trilinear filtering to the stage in rendering where the appearance and color of objects are determined. So long story short, this only affects DirectX programs, so you don't really need to worry about this too much, and it won't degrade performance in applications that are not using the DirectX API. So I would say go for it because it doesn't actually degrade the image quality that much at all. So you may see some performance impact, and if you don't, there's still no negative to it anyway. So go ahead and try it. Secondarily, negative LOD bias is another one of those settings that I've seen oddly controversial in the community. This is really an antiquated technique. It's not really used anymore in games for texture filtering as a whole, but I did find this informational Reddit thread, and yes, I did just say that sentence, that helps clear up that DLSS may use it in some cases where games actually ask for it. So if you do like using DLSS on occasion and you want to try to get the best quality you can out of DLSS, you may want to try leaving this to allow and just letting it go. It really doesn't give you much performance either way, so you can just leave this to allow regardless, and you shouldn't notice any performance degradation whatsoever. Allow just, well, allows the game to use it if it wants to collect that information. Now for texture filtering quality, I swear to you that Reddit is not my only source. A user here summed up my argument with this pretty well actually, saying that simple thing is that nobody actually knows what's going on here because Nvidia has never shown exactly what it does. The best explanation we have is that the Nvidia Inspector creators' official explanations on each setting, which are like 10 years old or something like that, they're a while back. There really isn't much of a performance impact regardless of settings, and I mean like a maximum of like 1 to 2 FPS difference. So I would shoot for a little bit more clarity just in a competitive setting for you to be able to spot the enemy quicker. That's just my view. If you want to make sure you get maximum performance, I would simply shoot for performance and not high performance, as high performance is not necessarily meant to give you higher performance in gaming specifically. Correction, it was high quality that was used for applications. So don't go above quality, but high performance does supposedly give you more performance, but really it's a 1 to 2 frame impact on most cards. You don't need to worry about it that much. Jumping down to the final setting in the texture filtering tree, it's trilinear optimization. I really have the same opinion on this as the anisotropic sample optimization. They're only using this setting in DirectX titles anyway, and it also has very little downside. According to Nvidia, it quote-unquote improves texture filtering performance by allowing bilinear filtering on textures in part of the scene where trilinear filtering isn't necessary. And I'm gonna... That's the most nerd emoji sentence I've ever said in my goddamn life. Long story short, it doesn't have much downside. You should just turn it on. If you notice a downside when you turn it on, turn it off. You'll be fine. I know using the terms bilinear and trilinear and all these other terms are kind of hard to understand. I may include just some like basic definitions for that sort of thing in the comments too, or in like a Q&A or whatever. I might answer some questions on stream about it as well. So just just be wary of that. If you have any questions too, that's a good point. Check out my stream. I will also link that in the description. We do it weekly at 6-ish, 7-ish, something like that p.m., sometimes 8 on Fridays. It's Friday nights. Should stop by. We just hang out. I play some Tarkov. We answer questions. We vibe. So come on by. Threaded optimization. Again, this is one of those settings that I have the same opinion with as Trilinear optimization. There really is no reason to have this off. It just allows for multi-threading for use in rendering frames to more than just the main thread. So like, if you ever have a DirectX 11 title, for instance, I'm pretty sure DirectX 11 titles tend to force all the frames through one thread. So this will attempt to distribute that load to more CPU threads to improve your performance, as you're not getting bottlenecked as hard by that one lane in your highway, to put it in an analogy. Triple buffering, no. Triple buffering is just an extended version of VSync. It just buffers frames back. It's also only applying to OpenGL applications, so who really cares? VSync. Personally, I just have the 3D application setting set like this, so that if I really want VSync, I can just have it on if I'm frame limited anyway. But I'd recommend, for the best latency possible, to have this off, unless you really hate having frames tearing. If you've ever seen that tearing halfway through frames, that can happen with really quick movements, or like if you're moving really quickly, like flicking. VSync does help alleviate that by capping the frame rate to your monitor's native hertz, so like 60 hertz, 120 hertz, 144, etc. But it really shouldn't be used in a competitive setting, as it can increase your input latency as you're rendering fewer frames per second if you are capping your frame rate and you can go past that frame rate. The rest of these settings down here, I really wouldn't worry about. You can just leave these to their default settings, as they shouldn't affect your frame rate. And they are, well, 2 of these are used for virtual reality, and the other one is just a preset for the DXGI swap chain for APIs. You don't need to worry about that sort of thing, as most of these settings are set for older applications who, say, need to be switched from a older API to a newer one and need a way to swap over to said newer API. Anyway, regardless of that bullshit, I think we're finally done going through all these 3D settings. I know there are other settings in this application to cover. I will get to them at some point in a different video, but I didn't want to make this video too long, as I'm sure it's going to be incredibly long already, and I don't think people want to sit and listen to me rant for that long. So I really hope you guys appreciate this video. I'm going to try to make this video as engaging as I can, even though it's just me blabbering on about random settings. If you do have any questions, please do leave them in the comments, or ask me on a stream, or ask on Discord, what have you, as I really do like answering your guys' questions about these sort of things. And I hope this helped. If it did, make sure to like, make sure to subscribe, all that stuff, and I won't bore you with it. This is Clem, clocking out. Later.